I didn't want to go through life as a hypocrite or someone who's putting on a show for others. If there's any point in my continuing on, you've got to show me right. You got to show me right now.
I am here today inside the beautiful Watersprings Church in Idaho Falls, and I'm talking with James Runcorn. He is one of the pastors here at Watersprings Church. He started out as an actor in Hollywood and eventually decided to leave that life behind and pursue a life of ministry and faith. And so those are the things that I'm excited to talk about with you today. James, first of all, tell us about just so far the few years you've served as a pastor here in Idaho Falls. What has that experience been like for you?
That's been great. First of all, we love the community. When we were looking to leave California, back before it was trendy and cool, my brother had moved here, and we visited, fell in love with the area. And then that was also the time I was transitioning out of Hollywood, so we were looking for the next place to move. Idaho Falls won our hearts.
What was it that initially brought you here to Idaho Falls?
So, little complicated backstory. I was adopted. My biological brother moved here several years before 2016, and we wanted a good relationship with our nieces and nephews, and it was kind of complicated trying to visit during summers. We wanted to be a little closer. So that was one of the main catalysts for moving to this area.
So I'm like I said, I'm so excited to talk about how you decided to get into this path of ministry. Let's go back and talk about, what was the pivot point for you when you decided to, basically when you accepted Christ into your life?
When I was 3 years old, we were visiting my grandpa's church in Southern California, in Carlsbad, California. Okay. I remember the teacher showing this picture of Jesus knocking at the door of the heart, and she said, "Do any of you want to open up your heart to Jesus?" And I raised my hand and I prayed the prayer, "Jesus, please come in, be my Lord." And I went out to tell my grandpa, who was one of the pastors at that church. And I tugged on his robe and I said, "Grandpa, I just asked Jesus in my heart." And he looked down at me and said, "Well, it's not legitimate. You're too young to understand." And I was confused because I didn't know what legitimate meant at the age of 3, but that word stuck with me. And that sent me on a tailspin for a number of years, trying to figure out if I had done it right, if I'd done it the right way, if I had finally done it the legitimate way of entering into relationship with Jesus. So that was a huge challenge. I think that continued all the way until I was somewhere between middle and high school, trying to figure out if I got it right.
Your grandpa's reaction to that, it's not legitimate. How did that make you feel?
Well, as a little kid, it hurt. I was so excited that my grandpa, who was a pastor, I was trying to tell him about this exciting decision I'd made. The worst part wasn't the hurt in the moment. It was that confusion of knowing if I'd done it right. See, here's the interesting thing, from a biblical standpoint, the way of doing it right is turning away from your life of sin and turning and pursuing Jesus. And there isn't a mantra, there isn't a way of phrasing it right. It's all about the condition of your heart. So if you run across a kid, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, whatever, whose condition of their heart, as innocent as it is, saying, "I want Jesus to be my Lord," don't disregard it. That's my best tip.
Yeah, and all you wanted was some validation from your grandpa. From that point on, you got into your teenage years and kind of wandered, sounds like, a little bit.
Well, yeah, as a young teen, preteen and young teen, I did have it in my heart to be a missionary. I thought, well, I'll just follow the family path and maybe go over to China and be a missionary. I was kind of set in that path. And then when I was 14, almost 15, I realized I'd gone to church every Wednesday night in Awana programs. I'd gone Saturday night when my parents were at choir practice, Sunday morning, every service. I was raised in the church, and that's all I knew. I knew the world, but I'm saying religiously, that's all I knew was the evangelical Christian perspective. That's what was spoon-fed to me from infancy all the way up. Then my dad began to experience some interesting things. He told my mom and me that he'd met his guardian angel. So that was pretty weird, except I knew in the Bible people had angelic encounters. So it seemed like, wow, that's credible. I could believe that because my dad was a really good Christian man. As the days went by, he began to tell my mom and me that we were going to meet our angel. I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. But nothing happened. And he was 6'6", 6'7", booming bass voice, and he wasn't, he wasn't the type to be aggressive and imposing, but physically and vocally he was a little intimidating. He began to, his voice would change as he was starting to speak, as if the angel was speaking through him. And that became kind of scary. And then a couple of weeks into it, his voice got really deep as he said God was speaking through him. And at this point realized my mom and I still had not seen any angels or anything. And we also were very conservative. I went to an evangelical free church. So in the worship time with the music and everything, people didn't really dance around in the aisles. Nobody spoke in tongues or anything. But every night for about a week straight, he was speaking in tongues all night long. And that was pretty scary for me. We had a very small house. I covered my head up with a pillow so I could sleep. And then I came home from a friend's house, I think it was the next week, and I found out my dad had been taken away. Apparently at work, he grabbed his boss and picked him up and said, Jesus loves you, he wants to save you. And they sent him home, and they obviously could see something was wrong. But it took several police officers to handcuff him to a gurney and get him into the mental section of the hospital. And come to find out, he was having a massive nervous breakdown, chemical imbalance. So for a young man who was almost 15, my foundation of faith was kind of shaken. Mm-hmm. My dad was nuts. And then I began to question, did the people who wrote the Bible have euphoric experiences that weren't grounded in reality? Was the Bible then just a bunch of stories composed of people who were having these mental breakdowns? And then later that year, my mom died from kidney failure. So I was on my own at 15, and I began to drown my pain in physical relationships with girls in the church and experimented with some substances. And I checked out even other religious systems, Eastern religion and Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormonism and Buddhism, just all kinds of stuff, trying to find something credible that I could cling to. I got kicked out of church because the leadership found out that I was just falling. And that's the one place I really probably needed to be more than anything, because that's where I had my community with the youth leaders and friends that I had, but I lost all of it. It took a number of years of searching, and I finally was able to determine that archaeological evidence, secular evidence, it all pointed to the fact that Jesus was a real person. And in digging further, the credibility for the writings of Scripture, the original source documents, it was all believable in terms of, it's not just some legend that thousands and thousands of years later got jotted down by someone. You look at history, the writings of Plato or Socrates. From the time of their death until the first manuscript that they have, there's about 1,000 years separated. You look at the history of the Gaelic Wars and things like that, you've got almost 1,000 years separated from the actual event until it's actually written. And by secular historians, those are considered credible documents because it was an oral tradition. You'd pass along the history as we're talking right now, nothing written down. But when you get to the writings of the New Testament, the stack, and then you have a stack of documents like this with Plato, Socrates, history of the Gaelic Wars and all that stuff. And then you have the documents for the New Testament writings are like this, massive stacks. And those are separated by the actual events by about 30 years. 30. So when these writings, the documents that we have today, are compared to the actual events, people who were alive at the time of the event could have verified whether or not those things actually happened. Paul writes to the church in the New Testament, and he says, after Jesus resurrected from the dead, he appeared to more than 500. And that's like a viral video these days. I mean, did Rodney King get beat down? Yeah. Were you there? No, but I saw the news clip of it. You know, same thing with all the craziness that's happened over the last few years. Can you verify it? Yeah, it was on the news. I saw it. I know people that were there, you know, that kind of thing. So when there is historical evidence for someone who walks out of the grave after being in the grave 3 days, that's viable, that's verifiable, you know. And then what do you do with that? Well, what claims did he make? He claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life. He said, no one comes to the Father except through me. He claimed to be God. That's why the Jewish people wanted to stone him. He said, what good deed are you trying to stone me for? They said, not for any good deed. It's because you, a mere man, are claiming to be God. He said to the people in the temple, when he's reading out of the prophets of the Old Testament, which was the Jewish people's scripture, he said, today this scripture is fulfilled in your ears. He was the fulfillment of the law. He was the one that the entire Old Testament of the Bible was pointing towards. And the reason that I believe it with all my heart is because he conquered death. And it was an eyewitness account by tons of people. It's not just some nice little story or myth. There's nothing nice about the story. You're looking at God becoming man for the purpose of redeeming a broken and fallen humanity, to restore that broken relationship with the Holy God. And when you understand the weight of that, the act of love that was, you're left with the decision, do I either accept it or do I reject it? And I accept it, and because I accept it, I have to turn away from my life of sin, and I have to turn and pursue Christ. And then I have to do everything that he's called me to do, which is to love the unlovable, which is to feed the hungry, provide for the needy, meet people where they're at, and let them know there's hope.
So how old were you when you came to this realization?
That was probably late high school, getting ready to graduate. So you're looking at maybe 3.5, 4 years of this journey of searching and flailing.
All growing up, you had this mentality, I'm going to follow this path of faith. You wanted to be a missionary, and that was kind of the route you were taking. So at what point did the thought occur to you, I'm going to go pursue acting? When did that start?
Yeah, so I changed schools when my mom passed away, and I found this, the whole point of me being at that school was, it was a polytechnic school, and the police science program for the senior year sounded kind of cool. Just, that was it. One class sounded really cool to me, so I went to that school. But when I was on my own, I went to this school called Roosevelt School of the Arts, and it had a great program at the time. Someone who was a couple classes ahead of me, Audra McDonald, she's won multiple Tony Awards, and in my class, Mick Wingert has a huge voiceover career. He's voiced Po the panda in Kung Fu Panda series on TV, and another guy in our class, Chris Gorham, has been on all kinds of shows, Ugly Betty and Jake 2.0 and Covert Affairs. He was the blind guy, Augie, and just a lot of great work has come out of that school. So in my hurt and having been rejected from my church in a sense, I found this artistic community that was very accepting and loving. And I found this whole new world of performance that I was able to vent all those emotions that I didn't know how to deal with, in a sense. And so it just seemed natural, hey, may as well go to Hollywood or New York and keep doing this because it's fun. So that's how that journey started. That's also where I met my wife. She did my makeup for a play.
What were some of the things you appeared in? Some of the works you did as an actor?
Well, I would say, this is a very delicate line to walk, but first I joined the Army because I wanted to have a job to prove to my girlfriend's family that I could support her. And in the Army, I was infantry, but I was stationed at Fort Myer, Virginia, which is Arlington Cemetery, and I guarded the Tomb of the Unknowns. So I did hundreds of funerals doing the firing party, but then I worked as a sentinel at the Tomb of the Unknowns, and that, in a sense, is a show, because the M14s have no magazines, there's no rounds in there, the bayonets are not solid metal. You know, it's all about the honor and respect, but in a sense, it's a performance of reverence.
So how long were you in the military then?
I was in 2 years because a couple things happened. I got injured at airborne school. It messed up my knee and some other stuff pretty bad. And at the same time, my dad was taking a decline for the worse. So I was honorably discharged, but I was an only child. So I went back to California to kind of be near him. And that's when my wife and I enrolled at Fresno State to work on our undergrad in theater before we went to LA.
What was your first big acting gig, or, you know, a big break for you, I guess?
Well, I mean, that's kind of subjective to the way that the outside would view Hollywood versus if you're there as a working actor. One of the major hurdles that most people are trying to accomplish or jump over when they arrive there is to get recognized in the union. You want to join the Screen Actors Guild. So that was a huge thing once I finally walked through the right doors to join the union. In terms of my biggest break, it's really sad how much you or how little you get paid. My best year as an actor, I think I made $13,000 acting that year, and that's like, you know, poverty wages.
Yeah.
But that year, the reason I got paid so much is I worked on a pilot for NBC called Holding Patterns, and which never aired. And then I worked on an audio Bible that year called the NIV Live, and there were about 400 people in that cast. Patricia Heaton played Sarah, Abraham's wife. Jesse Cordy played Abraham. Jesse Cordy, he was the voice of LeFou in Beauty and the Beast. You know, Gaston's little sidekick.
Yeah.
Let's see, there were all kinds of recognizable names in that. But I voiced Mark and Micah and some other characters, so that it was a huge year for me. But oddly enough, what people get most excited about is because I was on an episode of Wipeout, and I don't get that. It's just a silly show where you get beat up. And anyway,
Kind of a reality show.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember if I remember that show or not. But you were on that show as a contestant?
Yeah. So it's, you know, American Ninja Warrior is for athletes. Wipeout is for average Joes who they're not afraid to be made to look like an idiot.
Okay.
As you get bounced around and knocked all over the place.
So okay, so that was kind of that's the one that's most prominent out there.
I guess so.
At one point, you were cast as Jesus in a play.
Yep.
How long had you been acting at that point, and how did that come about?
So a church that we went to, which at that time had about 15,000 active members, it's called Shepherd of the Hills in LA, Porter Ranch. They would put on a passion play every Easter, and I don't know if you've heard of the Crystal Cathedral, but they used to also do this massive passion play. Crystal Cathedral went bankrupt, so Shepherd of the Hills was kind of the big go-to passion play. And one year, just on a whim, I didn't have much going on, and I thought, well, I'll audition for the passion play. And I got in. I was a Pharisee, and there was someone else in the cast. At this time, I was also part of a professional Christian theater company called Actors Co-op, and they do a full season of musical, classic, contemporary, equity waiver shows. But there was another person from that company in the passion play, and she said, if I could just do ministry shows like this the rest of my life, I'd be satisfied. And I kind of looked down my nose at her like, what are you talking about? You're not a real actor if you don't want to get those good gigs. And but the next year, I got cast as Jesus, and something changed because I grew out the beard. A lot of places that I went, LA's a big town, but it's also a small town in a sense because you start to get to know people and recognize faces, and especially in a church where there's 15,000 members. I would walk in Starbucks or something and people would say, oh look, it's Jesus, Jesus is here. And it was kind of fun for a couple weeks, but then I started feeling this conviction. After the show is over, after the performance is over, after the beard comes off, are people still going to be able to see Jesus in me? Or is it just a show? And I didn't want to go through life as a hypocrite or someone who's putting on a show for others. I wanted to be the real deal. I wanted to be a true light in a dark world. I wanted people to know that there is hope. And then that conviction was weighing me down, where I was just thinking, at the end of my life, what am I going to, what are people going to say? Oh, he worked on this show, he worked with this person, he had these accolades, he won this award, and that's it? At what cost? Scripture says, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose his soul? I wanted to do something with the rest of the time that I've got that touches people's lives and has an eternal impact. So I shifted and went back to school and got a master's in ministry, and then I continued on and got a master's in divinity, and that's the time that Tina and I were looking with our family to leave LA and start to head somewhere else.
You moved here in 2016
Yep.
to Idaho Falls, and you said you had a family tie here or something?
Yeah, my biological brother.
Oh, that's right. Let's talk about, you've been at Watersprings now for about 2 years. What's your role with Watersprings?
So I'm one of about 9 in the pastoral staff. Pastor Ty is our lead pastor, and we've got Pastor Dave and Shane and Steve Redmer and Pastor Tim Rupp, who runs the Strong Blue Line Ministry and has had ties with the Eastern Idaho chaplaincy program. It's a great team. I'm the community discipleship pastor, so I oversee some of the ministries and home groups, and I get involved a lot in the community. I love working with other churches and people out there outside the walls of the church.
As a pastor in Eastern Idaho, what's the most rewarding part of that role for you?
I think the most rewarding part of the role of being a pastor, even Eastern Idaho aside, is you meet people. Here's the thing. It's pretty common to, whether you're in church or outside, just talking to people in general. How you doing? I'm fine. Well, the truth is, when you probe a little bit further, nobody's actually fine. Everybody's carrying something, Maybe on their way to church, they just had a huge fight, screamed at the kids. Maybe they're on the brink of divorce. Some people walking through the doors, they're getting ready to go home and slit their wrist or pull the trigger, and they just want to see if they hear something from God one last time before they make that decision. People, more often than not, they're falling apart. And the rewarding part for me isn't that I get anything out of it, but to be able to look someone in the eye and say, I'm here for you. I love you. I want to walk through this with you. I'll give you one example. This isn't about patting myself on the back, and I hope it doesn't come across that way at all.
Sure.
I live in a place up on the hill where there's a really beautiful scenic overlook of the city. People come down in our little cul-de-sac and they'll do all kinds of unspeakable things in their car because they think nobody sees them, but I've got kids, and I'll always go down and just very kindly interact with people. I've stopped a lot of things happening. Well, one time there was a car in the cul-de-sac, and I didn't recognize the car, and I was kind of going back and forth. Oh, I don't want to go down there. I don't know. I don't want to bother this person. I don't want to go down there right now, But I did. I was, all right, I'm going to go. So I walked down there, and I'm walking around on the passenger side of the car, and I kind of startled the lady that was standing there, and I said, are you okay? And she's like, no, I'm going to end my life. And I said to her, please don't do that. You've got a lot to live for. She said, what do I have to live for? I just got diagnosed with this condition and my daughter told me to go end it all. And I said, first of all, I don't know you, but you've got a beautiful smile. That's something you can share with the world. And I began this conversation. And apparently, she had just prayed and said, God, if you're real, or if there's any point in my continuing on, you've got to show me right. You got to show me right now. That's the moment I stepped into her line of sight and talked to her. So the rewarding part for me is trying to be faithful where He's called me. And I get to see stuff like that. Get to see people turn away from a dark ledge.
Yeah. That I want to go back to something you said earlier. You said when you were pursuing this life of acting, at one point you said to yourself, I want to be a light. You know, I want to be real. I don't want to be this hypocrite. And then you just told me this experience with this woman. What role can faith play in helping people in today's society with all these problems that people deal with?
If you allow culture and our Western consumerist mindset to guide you, you're going to end up on that dark ledge, because culture tells us, corporations tell us that there's something out there that can satisfy you. It's a bigger paycheck, and with that bigger paycheck, you can buy this, you can buy this, you can buy this. You basically have the power to meet all of your own needs. But the problem is when we attain those things, whether it's the new truck or the new wife or the new house or the new piece of land or the new clothing or whatever it is, it feels like there's a bigger void. That's why people are hopeless, have no hope to some degree, is because we're taught that we can satisfy ourselves, but the truth is we can't. The only way to have true contentment and satisfaction is to be in relationship with your Creator. And it's so easy. It's accessible. It's not like some secret knowledge that, you know, you have to be into Gnosticism to access through all these secret portals and hidden knowledge. No, it's free and available. That's what Jesus was, his whole ministry on earth was about, was saying the truth is here. I want to be in relationship with you. And so to be that light is to help people understand that hope. God doesn't accept you where He's at, or God doesn't accept you where you're at. He loves you where you're at. So it doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter how many mistakes you've made. It doesn't matter how many things you've done that are shameful or embarrassing or whatever. He loves you. He loves you, and He wants to be in relationship with you.
So shifting gears now, in the last few months, you have started a podcast where you talk to people about their experiences with faith.
Yes.
It's called Culture Crux. How did that podcast come about? What inspired you to do that?
Well, it's kind of what I do already, just naturally. I was meeting with a guy a couple months back who was in a really low place, and he said, the reason you're meeting with me is because you're a pastor. I said, no, the reason I'm a pastor is because this is what I do. And I think there's been a misconception, and I'm not going to paint a broad picture and throw everybody into this same category, but there's been a misconception by some that you have to have this script, you have to have this agenda, in a sense. You've got to, add your hashtags to the side of your airplane as you go and, bomb these cities. You look at people as just another number to accomplish. Nobody's a general statistic. Nobody's just a person without a story and a journey. Everybody has an individual story and a journey that brought them to this place, whether they're an atheist, an agnostic, a mystic, or a full-fledged, believer in Jesus Christ. Everybody has a journey that brought them to that point. And I like to get to the heart of a person's journey, because it's all about building relationships. I can't go up to someone and just have some script in my mind and well, do you do this? Do you do this? Say these words and you're done. And then I move on to the next person. No, I like to get to know people's history and story. And part of that, I feel like it can help equip the church to understand how to engage with people relationally. See, okay, I have a doctorate degree, but I don't have the answers to everything. I don't have the answers to a lot of stuff. And hopefully, as I'm stammering through and just talking to people in a person-to-person level, it at least inspires other people to do the same thing. Because I don't have the answers in the moment that everybody's looking for. But I do have the answer, and it's not just a churchy answer, it's the truth. I have Jesus. And that's what I want to share with people.
Wow. Wow. Well, James, I appreciate the conversation. Very inspiring, very uplifting. And is there anything you want to say about Water Springs? Any community events that are coming up, or things you want people to know about what's happening with the church?
Rhett, I would like to personally extend an invitation to you to be a guest on Culture Crux. I'd love to hear your story. You hear a lot of stories of different pastors, and I'd like to hear yours.
Okay. Yeah. I think that'd be great. Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, you said yes.